Purpose of the Nature Center is basically to educate the public, school children, about what we have in the natural environment in Hardin County. Trees, wildlife, water quality. Yeah, we're pretty fortunate. We get all walks of people coming through our doors here at the Nature Center. We get, of course, the school children for the field trips in the spring and fall. But we also have senior citizens come out with the elderly homes and things like that are found in the county. General public, we have public programs, and we usually have a very large turnout for the different programs that we have out here. Plus, we get a lot of tourists coming through on 20 and 35 that happen to stop in the nature area and check out the area and see what we have here to offer the public.
I am Becky Wabina, and I am the oldest of the Caulkins grandchildren. My mom is Marilyn.
And I am Justin Caulkins. My father was Jeff, and Homer is my grandfather.
And one of the first classes he took in his favorite class was zoology with Professor Sheridan. And he just made a huge impact on Grandpa. And he loved it so much, and he was really good at it, so he would help the other students in the class, in the zoology class. So there was his connection to the college. And then he was the first Hardin County Conservation Director. It was in 1981, and he had retired and had been doing this. Had started the nature area, and he started with just rehabbing small animals, birds. He couldn't stand the thought of killing something if it wasn't necessary. And it got bigger than he had first thought it would. People were coming from all over the state bringing him animals to rehab, and he had made the connections with like Bill Schmidt through the college and had worked with a lot of the Hardin County Conservation Board of Directors and made those connections. So I think it was a mutual agreement between him and the college. He depended a lot at the beginning, before it was through the college, on donations. Like Hy-Vee would send out their day-old breads and nuts and seeds instead of getting rid of it. And so he used whatever he had available to feed and to rehab.
Raccoons, squirrels, birds, something that get hit by a car, or it was county-wide. People would bring animals. They just phone up grandfather and say, "Hey, I've got this. Can you help?" "Oh, of course. Bring it on out." And it grew and grew and grew, like Becky said, to bigger than life. We got so many animals out here at one point that it's like, I guess we're gonna have to expand. We're gonna have to keep going with this, and grandfather wasn't gonna turn anybody away.
So it then became part of the Ellsworth College campus. So there was classroom. This was like an outside classroom to begin with. They also helped out as part of their learning, doing the chores, grooming the trails. And a raccoon that was injured enough that couldn't go back into the wild. A crow with a broken wing named Joe, who they taught to speak. And so the pens kept growing, and the animals kept coming, and the birds.
Grandfather was always trying to further education with anybody that's interested, and he had this vision for the Interpretive Center, and that's where we're at today. We've got the facilities out here to help people learn if they're wanting to. We're hooked up with Ellsworth and the programs they offer there for conservation.
The 70s were a period of a lot of environmental awakening, I would say. And Homer Caulkins was very much an enthusiast in this work. He was executive director for the County Conservation Board, first executive director, and worked 18 years doing that. When he retired, he began rehabbing injured animals at the farm here, and he and his wife and continued doing that for a number of years. In 1981, he and Ruth donated this family farm to Ellsworth trustees and asked that it be dedicated to outdoor classroom activities. Originally, the rehab that Homer and Ruth did was very attractive to the public. Homer was a born publicist, and the success that was attained essentially by the interest that people had in the animals and birds that were being rehabbed led to the Hardin County Conservation Board in, I think, 1993, taking over the management of the area. It was simply too much for Homer to handle, and his daughter Marilyn. And that management, coupled with the fact that the county hired a full-time naturalist, made it possible to do a great deal more in the environmental education. All of it was outdoors at that time. And one of the dreams, Homer was a practical man, but he was a visionary as well. And he was interested from the very first in a classroom at the nature area. Through a great many individuals' hard work and donations, that became a reality in 1996.
It's like a favorite fishing hole or a good mushroom spot. You have your favorite places where you just take family and that's about it, or go by yourself. Found a lot of different things, as everybody does that collects, from buffalo skulls to arrowheads and bone tools, ground stone tools, pottery. Most of the points out there are not true arrowheads. They're spear points or dart points. I have very few arrowheads. I don't have a good site where the true arrowheads come from. Some people do, and some people have a lot of arrowheads. Most of what I have are dart points. Been looking in the rivers and the creeks and the ravines for 43 years and have 40 what I call complete bison skulls. When I say complete, I mean both horns on them. A lot of broken ones. This area is very good for finding bones, bison skulls, because the last glacier stopped right here and left a lot of gravel, and gravel will preserve bones in water. I have 3 clovis points. They're the oldest and the rarest. I don't have any Folsom points. I'd like to find one of those, but there's Dalton points and Thebes and dovetails. And if you're a professional archaeologist, it's a conflict of interest to keep what you find, and I kind of like to keep what I find. So, but I had Toby Morrow, who is a renowned archaeologist, as a friend since he was a junior in high school. And I've known him for a long time, and he's very good, very knowledgeable, and helped me a lot. Obviously, fields that have been turned and streams that have been eroded, small creeks, big creeks, rivers, anywhere the dirt gets turned, there's a possibility of finding something. It saves wear and tear on your back, because if you have a stick and you see a rock on the ground and you don't know if it's something or not, you flip it over with your stick, and it's amazing the amount of times when you flip something over and you don't think it's anything, and until you turn it over, you find out it is something. Everything I found is surface collected, and if you don't catalog it and don't know where it came from, you lose all that information. it's important to know where they came from. Nobody likes a trespasser, you know. I mean, to acquire a good relationship with the landowner, it just means a lot. It's in my early days as a young kid, I was guilty of not asking, and as the years went on, it just a lot better just to ask, and you don't have to feel like you're sneaking around doing something, and that gives everybody a bad name when you do that. It got to the point where my basement was getting pretty full, and she was telling me not to be bringing junk home anymore. You know, just bring the good stuff. Well, to me, it's all good stuff. You know, with Caulkins, they agreed to take everything, which is really fantastic because there's a lot of things that don't look like anything, but to a trained archaeologist, they all tell the story. I've seen collections end up in the dumpster because they only weeded out the family, didn't want the bad stuff, the stuff that didn't look like an arrowhead.
I can't stress enough the importance of cataloging collections. So many collectors don't pay any attention to that and are only in it for just the fun of collecting. But once you bring something home, you find something, you bring it home, and you put it in a box and put it away, and don't do that, pretty soon all the knowledge about the location and of the find and that sort of thing gets lost. And then it becomes less than useful for archaeological research.
I've seen too many collections get sold or split up amongst family members, and all the historical value and information is lost then, and I didn't want that to happen. I've seen collections go to the auction block, and it just makes you sick because somebody spent a lifetime of collecting, and one day it's all gone. And Ellsworth, Iowa Falls have been good to me. I've known Bill Schmidt for a long time and talked to him, and he said there was an interest, and so I thought, if I could find a home for it, that'd be great.
Just in conversation, Jeff mentioned that he was looking for a permanent home for the collection to have on display for the public to see, and just from there we developed more talks and more communication, and came to the conclusion that he thought this would be a good home for his collection, and I agreed, and that's where it kind of led to. We looked at what our present situation was with display space, and came to the conclusion pretty quickly that we were going to have to expand the nature area just to accommodate this incredible collection that was coming to us. So that really got the gears turning about what we had to do to facilitate a building expansion, and what else we had to have involved from designers and artifact people, archaeologists, just to help us get the collection on display and what needed to happen with all that. We expanded the building, not as large as we'd like to because of cost prohibiting us, but we expanded another, I had to check on the exact dimensions, but we added a pretty good sized display area, twice of what we have currently. And to do that, we had to rely on grants. We did a lot of grant writing. Our friends group, of course, the Friends of the Nature Area group, helped with some of that fundraising as well, a large part of it. And just some donors in the general area, very supportive of Calkins Nature Area and what we've always been about out here. So it was actually an easy sell, and I feel we raised the funds very quickly, and that just goes to show you how the support of the area is for Calkins Nature Area.
The help that we have here with the archaeologists coming in, the information, the knowledge that they have, and the people that they're getting on board is just fantastic. We have pottery experts, we have bone experts, we have point experts, and these guys really know their stuff. So what you're going to be looking at is going to be very accurate, and I can't wait to see it all when it's done.
Jeff had done a very good job of recording his find locations and specimens that came from those locations well, basically he would take them to work and lay them on the photocopier and make a photocopy page of the finds of any particular collecting episode, and then he would write comments down about where they came from and that sort of thing, which is very good. Most collectors don't go to that level of effort to document their collections. For any kind of detailed archaeological research, we really need to have good locational information, and people often don't realize that when they're finding things. They get caught up in the moment and they don't think about where exactly they're finding things on the landscape. But for archaeological purposes, the more locational information we can find with a specimen, or that we can record with a specimen, the better off we are. I would say, with the documentation that he's assembled and the range of specimen types that he has represented in a relatively circumscribed area, I would say it's excellent. Well, he's got a lot of points and knives. A lot of the points are also used as knives. They're used for cutting, scraping, hunting. When you need to butcher an animal, that's what those kinds of tools are used for. They're used for hide working. They're used for processing all of our foods that we have. Of course, the pottery is there for cooking and storage. The axes are used for woodworking purposes. So that's, a lot of the general kinds of activities that these tools represent. A clue to that is usually the overall form of the tool. If it's a projectile point, for instance, with a broad blade and a relatively steep cutting edge, that's usually a good indicator of a knife. A very small projectile point would make a good arrowhead. So size is always an indicator of those sorts of things. We look for evidence of use wear along the edges of tools, and that's also another indicator. A good high-powered microscope will tell us whether it's been used for hide working or cutting plant material, that sort of thing. The catalog record will include its catalog number and a description of the type of specimen at various levels, whether it's historic or prehistoric, or whether it's a pottery sherd or a chipped stone tool, and then a more specific description of the type name, if we know it, and the raw material of the rock that it might be made from, if it's a stone tool, for instance. That would be the kind of specific information about the artifacts. There would also be information about the location as Jeff provides it to us. We use a labeling system that first of all encodes the collector's name, also the number of the container in which the specimen is held, and just an arbitrary number of the specimens within the container, so that there would be a unique number for every specimen within a given display case. But it certainly ranks up there among the larger collections that I have seen. We divide up the prehistory of Iowa into several major time periods, the oldest being Paleo-Indian, starting maybe 14,000 years ago, and lasting up to about 8,000 years ago, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. Next is the Archaic period, which is a pretty good chunk of time, extending from about 8,000 years ago on up to about 1,000 or 500 BC. From that point on, we have a shorter time period called the woodland period, which would last up until about 1000 AD. Then what we call the late prehistoric period, beginning at about 1000 AD and lasting up until the time of European contact, which would have been 1600 AD. So there's a good 500-year period of late prehistoric time.
Toby Morrow. I am a professional archaeologist. I work for Wapsi Valley Archaeology based out of Anamosa, Iowa. Even when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I decided I wanted to be an archaeologist because I thought those were the people that studied dinosaurs. I found out later that those are paleontologists, but I still wanted to be an archaeologist. And oh boy, when I was about 14 years old, I started finding arrowheads, projectile points, around where I grew up in southern Grundy County, around Beeman. And I was hooked at that point and just developed an intense interest in it. Went to the University of Iowa and got my bachelor's and my master's there in anthropology with an emphasis, or a sub-major in geology, rocks and bones and things like that, and started doing archaeology as a job, and kept me busy ever since. 1984, published Iowa projectile points because I noticed that there was no arrowhead or projectile point guide for the state of Iowa. All these collectors around here had all these artifacts and they didn't have anywhere to go to look up what they were and what they meant and how old they were. My initial focus was, and pretty much still is, lithic analysis, stone objects, artifacts, and the debris left over from making and using them.
There's a Mains Creek chert outcrop in Hardin County, and that was a sought-after material for making stone tools. Chert is what a lot of people call flint. It's not flint, it's chert. And when heat treated, it's very good for making stone artifacts. For a knife or a pointer, heat treated or not, it's a good tool making stone. Waste debitage from reducing a piece of Mains Creek chert down to make a point. There's a lot of waste material that comes off of a piece of chert to get to the final product. And that's a sign that you're in a good area when you start finding these waste flakes. A lot of times they would start out with the raw Mains Creek chert and use just a hammerstone to get the big rough edges off. And as they got closer to a complete point, they would turn to an antler hammer and then an antler tip for pressure flaking.
You're kind of on the northern fringe here in Iowa Falls of probably the second richest part of Iowa in terms of archaeology, prehistoric archaeology. And I contend that the reason that there's so much prehistory here, so much evidence of it, and most of this is in the form of stone tools and pottery and scraps and scripts, and ancient animal bones, things like that. Most of that, I contend, is because you're right in the middle of the lower Mississippian age Mains Creek Formation outcrop area. And that is the second most important stone material source for ancient native people that lived here in the state of Iowa. That's the second most important source of flint or chert for them. The Mains Creek chert is relatively good quality. It's not the best in the world, but it's very adequate, very good stuff. And it comes in big pieces. And that is probably the most vital thing. If a stone is beautiful and wonderful to work with, but you can't get a piece bigger than a golf ball, you're not going to be making any big spearheads out of that material. So I would say that is probably one of the big draws to this area. It's probably a reason that you have so many people coming through this area, through this part of the Iowa River Valley, and why they're hanging around here. And while they're hanging around here, they have no reason not to be chipping away and making stone tools, which means, oh, that one's half worn out, I'll make a new one. And that's why you have so much stuff around here.
I saw Toby Morrow make a point in 7 minutes.
Flint knapping is the process of making chipped stone tools out of a narrow range of types of raw materials that are hard and yet brittle and break in a manner similar to the way glass breaks. And that's how you chip them into shape, using hammer stones, antler or bone hammers, pressure flakers, usually made out of bone or antler tines, and gradually shape the pieces, whittle them down into the desired forms. It's a rather involved process, very, very painstaking. I knew the basics just from what little I was able to read here and there at our local libraries and the school library and things like that. From there it was experience, and over the years I started getting better, and then I started meeting other people that did it, that had been doing it longer than I was, picked up some things from them, and anymore. Nowadays, most of what I learn about making stone tools, I learn from the real deal, the prehistoric objects that I find. I'll pick up a stone tool and go, aha, I've seen that before. I've done that. And it's a very enlightening kind of little fun hobby that dovetails real nicely into my work. Well, there are two ways that rocks don't move naturally. Rocks do move naturally from glaciers. We have a lot of northern plains, south central Canada rocks around us all over here thanks to the glaciers that drug and pushed them down here. Streams also will drag rocks downstream. So you can get some spread of things like that. Rocks, distribution of stones that can't be explained by natural movements, things that are, say, upstream, or things that are up glacier, the wrong direction or side to side. They don't go with the natural flow of things. Those either got there from people actually physically traveling to that place and coming back, or through trade connections, one group to another down the line, or a combination of both. The general consensus is early on, we're talking 10,000 or so years ago, a lot of this movement is probably actually people moving with a little bit of exchange between them. Then when you start talking about 2,000-3,000 years ago, people started living more settled lives, and you see what's probably the result of actual formal trade.
Actually, the rarest was a moose skull that had the antlers cut off of it to make just what I talked about, a hammer for making arrowheads. And it was an interesting skull because it had cut marks in the eye sockets that I took it down to Iowa City and showed the archaeologists, and there was one of the archaeologists was wondering if they ate the eyes, and he turned it over and looked, and he showed me where the cut marks were, where they cut the eyes out. There's moose and there's bison, and we actually found a muskox skull, which isn't really an artifact, but it's an animal that lived probably before people got here. But everything between deer and beaver, got wolf remains, caribou, elk, just everything that used to live here, you find bones. I found one rib bone that was associated with a giant sloth. Mastodon teeth and a mastodon tusk.
It was the end of the last glacial advance. It was actually, at that time, the glaciers were already retreating. So this part of Iowa was probably fairly young terrain. Vegetation being reestablished and animals moving in. And with that change, I suppose you could have animals that normally lived quite a bit farther north. I mean, Lord knows we have things like muskox, and those are represented in the collection, along with ground sloths and mammoths and mastodons and all those fun critters. So it's quite possible that they were not so unusual this far south 11,000 years ago. The only further south occurrence of a moose that I'm aware of is late Pleistocene, also late Ice Age, and it's from central Missouri. This is the only moose bone I've ever heard of from Iowa. I'm still blown away by his moose skull. A moose skull in central Iowa. Now, every once in a while, a sick moose wanders down here and goes back home, but that's unusual. Very, very unusual. Now, what makes it really wow is if you look closely, it's a male moose. Males have antlers. You can see the stalks, the pedicles where the antlers grow from. The antlers are gone, not because they were shed. Antlers are shed by deer and related animals every year. Not because they were shed, but because a person or persons cut them off. One was sawed off with a stone knife and broken, and the other was chopped off with some sort of probably a stone cleaver. And I believe he has a radiocarbon date from that, which they're always iffy on a heavily mineralized bone like that. This thing has sucked up a lot of iron. It's very heavy. But I believe right around 11,000 years old. It puts it back about to the beginning of people in Iowa.
It adds a lot more learning ability. It adds different time frames. It has all these artifacts that are from the different periods that we didn't have out here before. Essentially, we're doubling what we have had before.
I think it's a piece of the puzzle. I think the vision was for people to constantly learn about nature and our surroundings right here in north central Iowa, Hardin County. And you could go on the trails, you could see the native animals and birds, but this is another huge piece of the puzzle that kind of makes it complete when you do come out here. You've got the history, you've got the past, and now you've got the present.
There were a number of factors that have contributed to the value of the collection. We, since the controversy of Highway 20 coming through the Greenbelt area, that lasted something like 20 years. And in that period of time, people became aware of what a gem we have in terms of the Iowa River Greenbelt, in terms of natural history.
I have seen, and I can't count how many, but a goodly number of pottery fragments representing types of pottery that I have not seen before, and probably would be representing types that will be new to Iowa archaeology. There are types of pottery showing up in the collection, and quite a few of them showing up in the collection that are typical of areas from elsewhere in Iowa, but we've never found them in this part of the state before. So it's adding to not only our knowledge of the distribution of cultures within the state that these things represent, but also we're broadening our range of kinds of things that were made in prehistory.
I was out here last week when we got all the tables out and got everything laid out in all his cases. He and I had never seen it all out like that at once. And it was astounding. And now that we're going through and we're putting little labels on each piece and actually looking at them one at a time and writing down formal identifications that'll be entered in this database for the inventory. We're looking at them individually now, and I'm seeing things that I didn't notice. You get kind of a visual overload when you're looking at one of these frames that has 50 or 100 points in it. And you don't really notice that one that has that odd little impact fracture or that really cool fossil inclusion or something in it. So it's been a really cool experience. There are 2 other collections in Iowa that might compare to Jeff's. Jeff's is by far the largest, best documented. We know where almost all of this stuff came from. Jeff kept some good records. He's got all kinds of notes and things about where these things were found, and all that's being tied together now. Those artifacts will now forever have a point of origin. We know which part of the Iowa River Valley they came from, which corner of which field, or which gravel bar near which town, that kind of thing. Because without that information, they're just pretty rocks. It's the largest and most representative collection of central Iowa prehistory there is. You would literally have to put just about every other collection that exists in a big pile to match it. The educational potential of it is, you can't estimate it. Can't put a value on that. It's going to give hundreds, hopefully thousands of people the opportunity to come and see this is the story of prehistoric central Iowa. And here it is in front of you. Here's the animals, here's the tools, here's the changes. It's going to be in a good home, preserved forever. One thing that artifact collectors, I guess, don't like to think of is that that beautiful spearhead that you just found has been around a lot longer than you have, and it'll be there a lot longer after you're gone. And it's nice for those things to find a more permanent home.
Well, that's the one thing that I'm the most excited about with this collection coming here. I think we are going to be a regional attraction in the Midwest for Plains Native American artifacts, and also being from this area, the artifacts, the majority of the artifacts being from this area, I think we're going to be a tourism attraction, and I think it's going to help bring people to the nature area. It's going to help educate people about the area and the Native Americans. Plus, we're going to also bring in a lot of people to the area that are going to come in for shows and things that we're planning on doing in the future. So it's going to be a huge draw, I think, to have this collection here housed at the nature area, and we're excited about the potential that it brings.
He's got something representing pretty much the entire time range of prehistory in Iowa.
Jeff, thank you so much for this donation and for helping continue my grandpa's vision and your vision for educating the future.
It's been a tremendous joy. I think people are what have made the nature area go. And the numbers of people and the way the communities have been brought together with the nature area, it serves the county and in fact several counties around this area. This is certainly an outcome that I think Homer would have been very proud of.
I want to thank my family for being putting up with me. My wife really went through a lot. She'd so many times pick me up from the creek when I take my boat down there, and pick me up from the river and drop me off. And it's always exciting. I mean, to me, it is. To find it, especially if it's a totally complete, perfect piece, it's just, for thousands of years they've been laying there, and somebody one time made that as was their lifestyle. That was, they depended on them to live, and whether or not they thought someday somebody was going to find it, we'll never know. But I'm just glad they made them. There are days when you think you're put there for a reason. You go to a certain part of the field, you go to a certain part of the creek. I could get into stories, but then you'd think I'm crazy, because there's times when you just think, well, something brought me right to this point.
Well, I think it provides the public with a greater appreciation of the breadth and the depth of the prehistoric occupation of the region. That's going to be one of the important parts of this collection. When the cataloging is all complete, anybody could come here and search for kinds of things and do their own research about them, and that's one of the advantages of having a cataloged collection.
I think that they would be amazed by the work that went into collecting this, and the passion that Jeff has for the same type of history that Grandpa had. I think he would love to meet somebody as passionate about this as him, and be thankful to share in the interest, and grateful that it's part of this nature area now.
I'm not sure there's enough words to describe what they would feel with this collection. It's enormous. It is an unbelievable collection. I'm sure Grandfather would have a mutual respect with his passion for what he has done essentially his whole life. This is his life collection that he is just giving us and trusting us to take care of it for him. I would love to thank Jeff for his generosity, for donating his love, his passion for all the artifacts that he has found in our backyard. He found all this stuff in Hardin County, and that means a lot to us.
What Jeff has given this nature area, it's 40 years of life's work for Jeff, and to give a gift like that, it's huge. It's at the same level as Homer and Ruth donating the area to the county and the community as a nature area. Without people like that, you can't have things like this happen. And I'm eternally grateful to Jeff for being willing to donate that collection.